Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very good evening and thank you so much for being with us on this evening, on this very special evening. And I don't know how about you, but I still do remember where I was when the white smoke came out of the Sistine Chapel. We're just stepping through the security scanners. My wife told me, even though it was just the second day, and I thought, not worth it really to go on the square, but she said, no, we have to go there. We're just stepping through the scanners, and everybody started running, and everybody was screaming, white smoke, and we ended up somewhere in the center of St. Peter's Square, and to witness this historic moment. My name is Andreas Thonhauser. I'm the EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief, and it's my honor and my pleasure to host you tonight and to guide you a little bit through this evening. Now, remembering when Pope Leo XIV stepped out on the balcony, it was truly a historic moment. And it's also what I told to our staff here in Rome. EWTN has around 40 employees here, and we had 50 more colleagues from around the world joining us, because for 4 weeks we had 4 studios in the square and in Via Constellazione running to report on these historic moments for an audience in 460 million TV households. It wasn't always easy, and it was a lot of long days and a lot of long nights. But what I tried to share also with our team is that surely those are moments that we'll talk about in years to come, that we'll share with our children and maybe even our children's children. And to make that task easier and to remember it well, one of my esteemed colleagues wrote a whole book about it, and wrote a whole book about Pope Leo XIV. So it's my honor and my pleasure also to welcome Dr. Matthew Bunson, and I hope you will help me welcoming him here tonight. Thank you. Maybe if I can already ask you to come up there. Matthew, you are the Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. You're an American author of more than 50 books, probably I should say 60 or 70, but you're also a historian, a professor, and a theologian. You're a senior fellow at St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and you're on the faculty at Catholic International University. You're also the author of, as I said, many books, but amongst them the Encyclopedia of the Roman Empire, the Encyclopedia of American Catholic History, and books on Pope Benedict and also Pope Francis, and I believe with Pope Francis, it was also the first English language biography of him in 2013.
That's correct.
So I don't say it should have been easy for you to write that book in a very short amount of time.
Well,
but
in my
really,
case, practice makes perfect, or at least an effort at it.
Well, we'll hear about this in a second. And you will read us now a passage from your book. It's already available in the US in print and electronical form. Here in Europe, still in electronical form, but we're expecting the shipment of the first printed books any day now, really. But please, Matthew, if you would give us the honor to read a few passages from your book.
Well, first, let me say what a privilege, what a joy it is to be with you here tonight. I also have to add the most important detail of my bio, that I am husband to Bonnie Bunson, who's here tonight. Everyone who knows her in this room knows why I'm married to Bonnie Bunson, and the mystery remains why she's married to me. I mention my wife especially because we were on the set, Monsignor Roger Landry and I, along with Monsignor Alvarado, in our coverage for EWTN, when suddenly the white smoke came billowing out of the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. And there was a frenzy, of course, and I texted Bonnie, who was in the Borgo Pio, and all I texted was, "Habemus Papam." And she immediately started running toward the St. Peter's Square to come to our offices on the Via della Conciliazione. And what struck me as I was actually thinking about it was that she was texting, so many people are running to the square. And I thought to myself, and I think we even commented on it at some point, Monsignor, on the air, that this is one of the great traditions and customs among the Romans, that when the fumata is suddenly appearing, the fumata bianca is there, everyone goes running to the square. And sometimes even if it's black, they still go running to the square. But it was a reminder, too, of the importance of continuity and the fact that after the sede vacante, we have a pope. And of course, within a very short amount of time, we were rather amazed to discover Robert Francis Prevost, a US-born cardinal, had been elected. And I know that the cardinals themselves were even more surprised when he took the name Leo XIV. So it was with that in mind that we started working on this project. We recognized that a lot needed to be done. We can talk a lot more about the genesis of the book. I mention all of this because I think the choice of his name is really very significant, and the fact that he's an Augustinian. So what I wanted to read, just a brief portion of the book as we begin to unpack the things that he has said so far and the direction, I think, where we may be headed as a church. So the pontificate of Pope Leo XIV is still only days old, and yet there is a sense of clarity and mission about it that began from his walk onto the world stage on May 8th. Among the reasons for the sense of certainty and immediate stability is a deliberate decision he made to dress in the traditional vesture of the popes, adding to the papal white soutane and pellegrina the red mozzetta and stole. This was not a rejection of the deliberate simplicity of Pope Francis, but a conscious effort to connect himself, and with it, his pontificate, to his predecessors and the long customs and symbols of the papacy and the church. This drawing of a line of continuity and integration goes far beyond the merely symbolic or the sartorial. There's a manifest desire to achieve the integration of recent pontificates, the Second Vatican Council and the Fathers of the Church. This is not some effort to placate perceived factions or camps in some ecclesiastical power struggle. Rather, it is mining the rich treasures of teaching that characterize the great fathers, the council, and the modern popes to build unity in the church in a fractured era. Pope Leo XIV believes that these teachings can impel the church toward unity rooted in Christ and prepare all of us for the immense task of evangelization to which all of us are called. This integration has been on display since the first Urbi et Orbi blessing on May 8th and has continued virtually every day since. It is obvious in the use of references in his public speaking and preaching to the Second Vatican Council, especially the documents Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes. The church fathers, including Augustine, Pope St. Gregory I the Great, Ephraim the Syrian, and Ignatius of Antioch, and to all of his recent predecessors. Like these and many other predecessors in their times, Pope Leo XIV faces a host of challenges at the start of his pontificate. Today, they include war in Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere, the technological revolutions and the threat to the human person, growing secularism and atheism and the hatred of religious belief, mass migration and the quest for work and dignity, social and cultural fragmentation, threats to the family and human life from gender ideology, abortion, euthanasia, and surrogacy, and divisions within the church, most conspicuously the German synodal way and its heterodox enterprise for the church in Germany. Our new Holy Father seems convinced that the road ahead for the church and the world is by hearing and applying the timeless teachings of the church in new situations and circumstances. This is why he is so consciously integrating Augustinian and Leonine thought in a deeply Christocentric way. Chicago, Peru, Rome, pastor, teacher, missionary, prior general, bishop, cardinal. Pope Leo XIV has seen and experienced the church in more contexts than perhaps any other person currently living. He understands that the needs of the people of God are, in many respects, quite different in each of those contexts. He knows that the church must be responsive to those needs in a nimble and humble way. But most of all, to repeat some of Leo's most important words from earlier in this book as I write, the underlying challenge that Christ left us to preach the gospel, and this is the same everywhere. What Pope Leo XIV, following the great St. Augustine himself, will bring to the papacy is an uncompromising emphasis on the divine person of Jesus Christ. This is the same everywhere because he is the same everywhere. He is the one whom everybody needs, whether they are materially poor or spiritually parched. He is the only principle of unity that can unite Chicago and Peru and Rome and every place and every person in between. In illo uno unum, in the one we are one. That, more than anything else, is what Pope Leo XIV believes, the world needs to know today.
Matthew, thank you very much. And allow me to join you here and take advantage of you being here to, on the one hand, ask you a few questions, but then I would like to turn it over very soon also to our audience here. Maybe you also have a few questions for Matthew and on Pope Leo XIV. Let me start off, and you already shared a little bit about this, but who is Pope Leo?
Yeah, well, the most simple and direct answer is that he is the Vicar of Christ. And it sounds dramatic to put it that way, but he is the 266th successor to St. Peter. He is the 267th Pope. He is the man who has been chosen clearly by the vast majority of electors in the College of Cardinals to succeed Pope Francis, but not just to succeed Pope Francis, but to succeed all of the popes who preceded him. In understanding him, though, we have to understand where he came from. I mentioned Chicago, Peru, Rome. Yes, he is a U.S. citizen, but he is, as one American cardinal put it when he was being interviewed at the North American College after the conclave, he is a universal person. He is someone in the world, but not of the world. He is somebody who, by his call to the priesthood and to the life of the Augustinians, embarked on an absolutely stunning journey. One of missionary faith, one of a commitment to places that when he embarked on the novitiate in the Augustinians, he had no idea he would be going. Something tells me he did not anticipate going to Peru, or that he would spend 20 years there, or that he'd come back to Peru as a bishop, or that he'd be head of the Augustinian order, meaning that he would travel the globe. So as I mentioned, he really is profoundly somebody who understands and has, I think, a finger on the pulse of the world. And what is so remarkable about it is that as time progressed leading up to the conclave, more and more cardinals came to appreciate exactly who he is and why he was, at this moment in time, the person that they felt they could entrust the keys of Peter to.
Maybe before we come really also to his office, could you tell us a little bit more about his biography? What made him become, or what made him choose religious life? What made him become a missionary?
Yeah, well, it's, as he himself has said, he is a son of Augustine. He is somebody who has lived the Augustinian life for 55 years, because he went into the junior seminary at the age of 14 in Michigan, although he grew up in, very famously, Chicago. He grew up in what would be seemingly very ordinary circumstances. This is essentially a middle-class family. He loved and still loves the Chicago White Sox, which I know is a source of some frustration for Monsignor Landry, Boston Red Sox fan. But I mentioned that especially...
This is a big thing in the U.S.
This is a big thing in the U.S., yes. But a White Sox fan who played baseball as a kid, who by every measure had an ordinary life, and yet, because his family was also, because of his father Louis, because of his mother Mildred, he grew up deeply in the faith, in the Catholic faith, in an era of faith in the 50s and the 60s. He was born in 1955, that decade before the council, and then as he came of age in the decades after the council, with all of the changes in the church. But that experience of priests who were always around the house. His mother was a great cook. She was also brilliant, graduate degree, librarian, but also somebody who welcomed into their house so many priests. And I think that experience was one of the first things that began this process of a vocation. But then he had, along the line, these encounters with Augustine and the Augustinians themselves. And so he made that decision with the support of his family. And this is one of those great lessons for all Catholic families, that as their son discerned a vocation, they gave him the space to discern, but they also gave him the great encouragement to discern that vocation. And even when we know that he may have had some questions, I wouldn't say doubts, but he was trying to understand what God was actually calling him to do, his father was pivotal in those moments. He already had the deep faith from his mother, but his father was there for him to help him with that. And that set him on this course. And of course, the Augustinians immediately discovered that they had on their hands a truly brilliant mind, but somebody who also had almost a remarkable sense of prudence as well as fortitude. You need both if you're going to be a successful missionary.
Being a father to three sons, I do feel a little bit of pressure right now from being here put on my shoulders. But that's very interesting. You said a son of Augustine. How did those experiences, or those early experiences, how did they form him, shape him, help him now also for this office that he's taking?
Yeah, well, he quotes St. Augustine in almost, I mentioned the Church Fathers, but he quotes St. Augustine especially. But there are certain elements of the life of the Augustinians, the Augustinian rule. You know, this is one of the great mendicant orders in the Church, along with the Dominicans and the Franciscans. He is the first member of the Augustinian order to become pope, which to my mind was slightly surprising. There have been other popes who had connections with the Augustinian tradition. I mention that because the rule of St. Augustine encourages community life, but it also encourages a deep prayer life, but also a life of service, of sacrifice, but also that relentless search, as Augustine himself had, for the truth. And we see the influence of Augustine on Pope Leo's very coat of arms. It is on one side, the fleur-de-lis, a recognition of the role of the Blessed Mother in his life, but then on the bottom portion, the bottom right, it is this traditional symbol of the Augustinians, which is a heart on fire, pierced with an arrow, the arrow of love. But you cannot have that and be an Augustinian without what it's resting on, and that is the book, the Gospels, that you must have a combination of love, but also of learning, of heart and mind. And as we have gotten to know Pope Leo over these days now since his election, we can see as more interviews come up, as more things from the past come up, how Augustine sort of tempers everything he says. It characterizes everything he says, and how deeply imbued Augustine is in just his whole manner and way of speaking, of the fact that there is this quest for God, but the closer you come to God, the more you are impelled to love of neighbor. So love of God drives us to love of neighbor. And I think it was as he began to experience the depth of Augustinian thought that this vocation, not just to the priesthood, but to the Augustinians themselves, impelled him to live that vocation, that call to love God and to love neighbor in the very specific environment of the Augustinians.
And we could observe that also in the homilies that we heard in the first days, really.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, on the very night that he came out onto the loggia of St. Peter's, and all of us were quite struck immediately by the fact that, as I mentioned, the Mosetta, all of that, anchoring him immediately in the beauty of the papacy. But then he quotes Augustine. He quotes Augustine the next day, and he keeps quoting Augustine. But he has also made the point about the application of Catholic social teaching, and I know we can talk a little bit more about that and why he chose the name Leo in honor of Leo XIII in large part. But the phrase from Augustine, inquietum cor nostrum est, donec requiescat in te, which means our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so for Pope Leo, it's very clear that he understands that the process of personal conversion, of the process of searching for the peace that only Christ can give you. It's why he was so specific, and we can expect him to remain very specific as somebody who holds a doctorate in canon law. Precision is everything, but he was very specific in not simply saying, peace be with you, but he talks about the peace of the risen Christ. So it isn't an abstract kind of peace. It is the peace that only Christ can give you. It is the peace that Augustine came to know, and the peace that Augustine tried to pass on throughout the whole magnificent history of the church to those who follow him. And I think Leo, in that sense too, has so closely embraced all that Augustine has to offer and now wants to use that as one of the great lenses for his pontificate.
Matthew, allow me maybe a little bit more on a personal level. You've been hosting for 4 weeks now
Yes.
Our live broadcast here from Rome. Every day you've been up in the studio commenting on this. The funeral, the conclave,
Yes.
the inaugural mass. To you personally, What were the moments that really stood out?
Well, the moment in some ways that I'll remember most is the call. I think it was about 3:30 or so a.m. in Washington, D.C. on Monday, the 21st of April. We had watched Pope Francis come back from the Gemelli Hospital. He seemed to be recovering. He seemed to be doing all right. And then we saw him on Sunday. And I commented on air that I was especially struck by the fact that the first night we saw him was on the loggia of St. Peter's on March 13, 2013. The very last time that we saw him alive was on the loggia on Easter Sunday in 2025. And so the surprise first that he had passed, but then the sudden recognition that we had entered into, as the title goes, the sede vacante, the vacant see. From our standpoint, as a broadcast team, as a news division, but also very personally for me, it was as though a family member had died, that our father had passed away. And all of the emotions that come with that, but also the recognition, too, that we were then embarking on a period in the life of the church that for so many around the world is a source of concern, anxiety, not just that we are without a pope, but then who's going to succeed in. There is a beauty to the church's liturgies that if you allow yourself to really embrace them, to let them pull you in, you can go through this journey. And I talked about this on the air, that this was a whole journey for the church, but it was also a journey for all people of goodwill around the world. That we had the lying in state. We had the chance to go visit him in St. Peter's, to see him one last time. And then the translation of his body, and then the funeral mass, the intensity of that. But each of those has its own liturgy, each of that has its own moments of beauty, always surrounded, of course, surrounding the Eucharist as the heart of our faith. But then to experience those emotions of the Novendiales, of the 9 days of mourning. But then there's the practical side of broadcasting, of covering this, and then making the assessments about, okay, who possibly might be chosen by the Cardinals to succeed in. That whole journey is one moment in many ways, that it's a series of little seconds in a quick trip. I mean, it's already been a month since Pope Francis died. But it's deeply burned into not just my memory, but into my heart in terms of being here for each of those moments.
And honestly now, did you anticipate who would be stepping out on the balcony?
I will confess that in the days leading up to the start of the conclave, the name Robert Prevost kept coming up in conversations. And somebody who was actually in the room in the Sistine Chapel made the very similar observation, Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, who said that when he arrived here, all these other cardinals he was meeting with were asking him, what do you think of Cardinal Prevost? His name was very much present in conversations, as I was saying. We did an analysis thanks to Marco Mancini, one of our great reporters for Aci Stampa, the Italian language agency, part of EWTN News. And what he did was he assessed what we knew the cardinals were talking about in the general congregations. What were they looking for in the next pope? It included somebody who knew the law, somebody who understood the missionary field, somebody who understood synodality, somebody who understood the challenges facing the church in the modern world, somebody who understood the whole of the world, somebody who would be a good administrator, somebody who understood the Roman Curia. So we're looking at these boxes that you want to tick, and it became very obvious that there were certainly a number of cardinals who might tick almost all of those boxes. I think of Cardinal Pietro Parolin, for example. There's Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, who is Archbishop of Bologna, all these names that were floating. But Robert Prevost, Cardinal Prevost, ticked every one of those boxes. But then there seemed to be the insurmountable obstacle of the fact that he was from the US, that it was simply considered unthinkable that an American could be elected pope. If you remove that from the equation, he would have been at the very top of virtually every list that you could put together in assessing a pope. And at the end of the day, the members of the College of Cardinals made the decision and this was talked about by some of the American cardinals themselves, being an American was simply not an insurmountable obstacle as far as they were concerned. In fact, the fact that he was elected in only 4 ballots tells you that going in, they had a pretty good idea who he was, and that the fact that he was a U.S. citizen just didn't matter that much, which is surprising to all of us, I suppose. But it also tells us that, again, the cardinals were focused very much on who the church needed in this particular moment in time.
Very well. Very soon I would like to turn over. We have a microphone here. If there are already some questions, if you're still thinking of questions, maybe also during the conclave it was already clear, and you mentioned this, that the church would be facing or is facing a lot of challenges that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this and also what he brings to the table with regard to those challenges.
Right. Well, I mean, the first and most immediate one, I said his first words were, "Peace be with you." The peace of the risen Christ. Well, the most pressing problem that he's got is the largest land war in Europe since World War II, the great conflict in Ukraine. We know that already there is serious talk about the fact that the Vatican will host some sort of a gathering of discussions for possible peace between Ukraine and Russia. So that, I think, is uppermost, certainly from the diplomatic standpoint. He has spoken also about the crisis, the situation in Gaza, the ongoing conflict there, but he's especially focused on the humanitarian disaster that is emerging there. He has China, which, of course, he inherits the deal with the Chinese government on the nomination appointment of bishops, which also has brought with it severe violations by the People's Republic of that very same agreement, as well as the efforts consistent under Xi Jinping for the process of Sinicization in China, basically placing every religion in China under the thumb of the Communist Party, with all that that entails, especially and in particular for Christians. How he deals with that over the course of these next months, if we see more violations. Internally in the life of the church, I think he has 2 very pressing and immediate questions ahead of him. The first is what to do about the Germans. I mentioned the German synodal way. They wasted no time after the passing of Pope Francis to push ahead with their own agenda for the German church, especially when it came to things like ordaining women to the diaconate and unraveling the church's teachings on authority and the priesthood and all of our teachings on human sexuality. So there's that. And then, of course, there is the massive project that he inherits, but still left somewhat incomplete by Pope Francis, of synodality. He has referenced already several times in a number of speeches and homilies the synodal process or the synodal path for the church. But he is already seemingly, in a way, moving in his own direction with that. If we look, for example, he uses very specific terms, and I said earlier that as a canonist he's very specific. As a theologian he's also very specific. He uses phrases like the synodal nature of the church. He does not necessarily talk about synodality in the same way that Pope Francis does. And that's not a rejection of Pope Francis, but it is, I think, in much the same way that Pope Francis inherited the great project of Benedict XVI of the new evangelization. He is making it his own, and then he's going to apply it in a way that he thinks is most needed for the church, and in the direction that he thinks is most needed for the church. The 2 things about synodality that are going to be front and center for him, the first is the reports from the study groups on the vexed or controversial questions emerging out of the synodal process and the 2 synods in October 23 and 24, right next door at the aula. What to do with those reports. And then in 2028, we have this, we're not sure exactly what to call it yet, this gathering of the church that in the process ongoing, we're assessing where the church is in terms of the application and implementation of synodality. I suspect that he will, in his own way, be moving forward on synodality, but he's going to do it in a way that, as he himself keeps stressing, builds unity and communion in the church, in the life of the church. He clearly does not want synodality to be a source of division or controversy, and I think that's something we'll be looking for. And then he's going to have a host of other challenges. I think, for example, pushing ahead with the reforms of the Roman Curia here in Rome, as well as the appointments of very important people. Here in Rome, for example, who's going to be his successor for the dicastery of bishops? Will he keep Cardinal Parolin as Secretary of State? How will he conduct foreign policy? Will he be like Pope Francis?
So many things to throw in there. Also the financial challenges that the church is facing here. But maybe I can also turn it over to our esteemed audience. Are there any questions? Daniel, please.
Thank you. Hello, Matthew. We know each other very well from many years ago. I have one thing I would like to ask you is if you can deep on the remarks that the Pope has done about artificial intelligence. I think it's very surprising and also interesting issue. And also a curiosity, why the title of the book, The First American Pope? Don't you think Argentinians will feel kind of upset,
Yes.
Say, we are also American. Why this is the American Pope and the other one was not an American Pope for you?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the first one, your second question first, and that is why we went with the title of the first American Pope. I say that people have already called him the first Pan-American Pope. Now, we could call him the first US-born Pope. But when we're thinking of America, we're thinking also of the Americas. That the Western Hemisphere, yes, has already produced the first Pope in Pope Francis. But Cardinal Prevost brings with him he's a bridge builder. He's pulling together North and South America. He's a builder of bridges between those two. And in that sense, we see him as the first American Pope across that hemisphere, across the two hemispheres of North and Southern America, or South America. The question that I think you actually ask a really important question too about his focus on AI. He has mentioned it again on a regular basis since his election. It goes in many ways to why he chose the name Pope Leo XIV in honor of Pope Leo XIII. And Pope Leo XIV has said that Pope Leo XIII, in writing Rerum Novarum, that's the great Magna Carta of Catholic social teaching, that has given us then this great treasury of how we deal with the problems of the modern world. Leo XIII was dealing with the great industrial revolutions, the changes that it was causing in culture. Pope Leo XIV recognizes a very similar set of revolutions that are taking place. In this case, in our time, yes, there's industrial change, but he's thinking specifically of technological and intellectual change, of the impact of technology on society, in particular AI, artificial intelligence. But he's not simply applying Catholic social teaching in much the same way that when we think of Rerum Novarum, for example, we think of the Industrial Revolution, of capital, of labor. But he's actually taking us back to the very heart of Catholic social teaching, which is the defense of the human person, the dignity of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. And in that sense, Leo XIV is recognizing that we are in an era in which the dignity of the human person is now under direct threat from these new technologies, from artificial intelligence. And he wants to bring to bear all of the teachings of the Church on this moment. Pope Francis said it so well, that we're not in an era of change, we're in a change of era. And Pope Leo XIV wants to build on what Pope Francis did. I mean, there's a great document called Antica et Nova, where it reflects on AI. But now he's going back to what the Church can offer to the modern world in the defense of the human person, but also then the pursuit of what's one of those other key elements in Catholic social teaching, the pursuit of the common good. How do we build a civilization that defends human dignity, that defends the human person against all of these challenges, but that can also contribute to the building of a real civilization? And he's himself used the phrase, a civilization of love. All of that, I think, is tied up in why he chose the name Leo XIV, but why he's also so obsessed, so interested in AI.
And maybe also something that we see here in the Vatican. We've covered a lot of conferences that have taken place here. many experts also in the Vatican on AI, on new technologies, which are very much needed, where really this leadership of the church is requested, and where a lot of tech companies come here and ask exactly to have this discourse as well.
That's right. Pope Francis was very much ahead of the curve on this particular issue. It's remarkable to me that within days of his election, and this is not in any way a criticism of Pope Francis, but within days of Pope Leo's election, we're already talking about possible peace talks here at the Vatican. In exactly the same way, I think that we are going to see an acceleration of these discussions among tech leaders coming in to have these conversations about the impact of artificial intelligence. Why? Because the church can bring to the table so much clarity about the implications, not simply the science behind all of it and the technology behind all of it, but the implications of what can happen when we implement those, when we build those. And I'm looking forward to this aspect, especially of this pontificate.
Thank you. There was a question here. The microphone is coming from the other side.
Thank you very much. My name is Salvatore Rebecchini. Thank you very much for your introduction and for giving us this extraordinary piece of editorial that we will look forward to read. I just want to connect to your answer concerning the Rerum Novarum and the choice of the name. I'm not an expert, but Leo XIII wrote a lot about many other issues.
Yes.
About over 80 encyclical letters. And the Rerum Novarum comes after a series of encyclical in which he grounded all his reasoning about the New World on Tommaso d'Aquino, on Thomism. So do you think that this could also be an element in Leo XIV's approach to the analysis of the new things that we are facing?
I think so, yeah. It's funny you say that because I don't want to give away too much from the book, but it's not like a murder mystery where it has a happy ending, I promise. But Augustine might be for Leo XIV what Aquinas was for Leo XIII, with the sparking of the neo-Thomistic movement, of this heightened appreciation for Thomas Aquinas and the life of the church. I think that Pope Leo XIV may have that same emphasis in mind, where we turn to the great doctor of the church on so many of these key issues. One in particular that I think he will focus on is the idea of conversion. We are at a time when the world doesn't really recognize that anything's a sin, but the idea of personal conversion, but this transformation of our lives through this conversion. But then, as we saw in the life of Augustine, the series of conversions and the daily conversion that all of us have to undertake. So I think there are different levels that he's going to be able to approach Augustine and bring it to the world. And I'm delighted at the prospect that we could have this revisiting of Augustinian thought as it's applied to so many of the world's problems today, because I think it's a deep treasury of teaching.
One or two more questions here, please. Father Marcos.
Thank you for your great work.
Thank you.
I have two questions. First one, what is your interpretation on the fact that when Pope Leo appeared at the Loggia, he decided to use only two languages, Italiano and Spanish, and not English as his native tongue? And the second question is, would you tell us about the key message of your book in a few words? Thank you.
The key message of Leo XIV?
Oh, no, of your book.
Oh, of the book, sorry. Well, hopefully they're somewhat similar. Yeah, so in answer to your first question, I think he spoke in Italian, he spoke in Spanish, and then there was Latin as well. So that's a great language of the church. I'm not correcting you. My point is that we have these beautiful prayers that he delivers. But then there were two things of interest there. The first is that he recognized immediately, as Pope Francis did, that this is an election of choosing the Bishop of Rome. So he was immediately embracing his role as Bishop of Rome. This now is his diocese. So Italian is the language, essentially, of his diocese. But he also spoke Spanish as a way, I think it was very heartfelt on his part. He loved Peru. He loves Peru. He loves the diocese that he served at in Chiclayo. He loves the missions that he served there. And I think at that moment, he wanted to reach out to them, to tell them that he's still thinking about them. We all can take for granted the fact that he's an American. And I think it was a very shrewd decision on his part to speak in Spanish, which is also now one of the most important languages in the church, where the church is growing immensely, where there are also these immense challenges of evangelization and elsewhere. But then, the next day, at the very start of his Mass in the Sistine Chapel with the College of Cardinals, the cardinals who had just elected him, he did an extemporaneous little description, a little chatter in English. So he began that Mass in English, sort of an announcement that, yes, I'm aware I'm an American, but I recognize also where my heart is, which is in Peru, and where God has called me to serve, which is in Rome. Then in terms of the message of the book, we call it a portrait because that's what we really want to give you, which is an understanding, an introduction to Pope Leo that assesses his life, but also the influences on him, his formation, and then how all of that has been pulled together into the early days of this pontificate, where, again, we're seeing the importance of Leo XIII, of Leonine thought, but then also the importance of Augustinian thought, and where I think his pontificate is going to take us. And so far, I'm happy to say that there is no contravening evidence to the beyond what we have seen already. I think it is clear that Catholic social teaching is going to be monumentally important in this pontificate, but so too is my peace I give you. Peace be with you. That peace and unity in the life of the church are going to be the hallmarks of this pontificate to every degree imaginable by this pope. Why? Because there are obvious challenges in the life of the church, but there are even deeper challenges in the life of the world that he's trying now to proclaim the peace of Christ, the peace of the risen Christ to the world. And I think that for me is a central message of this book, because I think that's the central message of Pope Leo.
Peace be with you. Maybe allow me also to ask you along those lines, along those words, maybe as a concluding statement also.
Yeah.
Those were his first words, peace be with you. Many more followed. So from those first few days really of his pontificate, what future pope will he be, if you could answer that in a nutshell?
I think he's going to be a pope who is remarkably serene. One of the attributes that was discussed about Cardinal Prevost was that, as a member of the dicastery for bishops who knew him has said, he never saw him get angry. The faithful of Chiclayo, the faithful in the missions, always saw him as a man of deep inner peace. I think it was Corriere della Sera that referred to him as un papa calma. He is a very calm pope. He is, as the Italians, he's sereno. There is a serenity about him, and I think that in this era of the frenzy of social media, the shattering change in the world, having somebody who's this serene is going to anchor him for making some very difficult decisions that lie ahead for him in the pontificate. So I think we will see him serenely looking at problems, but doing so also, as Cardinal Chomoli, who's one of the cardinal electors, said, he is somebody who has one mouth but two ears. He listens before he makes any judgments. So I think this is going to be a pontificate, too, of a great deal of listening, a great deal of prudence. And then I will close with something that Cardinal Tobin, the American cardinal, the Archbishop of Newark, said, who's known then Cardinal Prevost and now Pope Leo XIV for about 30 years, because he was in the Redemptorists, Prevost was in the Augustinians. He said that the one thing that really strikes him about Prevost was that he doesn't pick fights, but he makes sure that they're finished. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but essentially what he's saying is that this is somebody who knows how to make a decision and to stick with it. This is going to be, I think, a pontificate of clarity, certainly I suspect in matters of doctrine, but it's also going to be one that is very decisive when the decision is made after what will be a suitable time of reflection, of judgment, of assessment, and listening. And I think that's going to be one of the lasting hallmarks of his time.
Matthew, thank you. A lot of hope for the church in this year, the jubilee of hope that we're in. This was not meant to be exhaustive. This was meant to be a discussion starter, a starter for conversations as well, which we hopefully have outside this room where we prepared for you a few refreshments. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. I would also be very remiss if I didn't extend my heartfelt thanks to the Campo Santo Teutonico for hosting us, but also to you, Andreas, and the whole team here in Rome, because this wouldn't be possible without you. And to be able to work with you and your team over this last month has been, as I've said, it's a privilege, it's a joy, plus it's just a lot of fun. So
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the team.